part 2, which is going to be much shorter because the thread is much shorter. And the original post was by a different user, and I jumped in upon reading part of one of Jeremy's comments. I'll begin with where the relevant part of the conversation can be followed. So, Alice the Sheep responds to someone else's comment, quoting them first, and then replying, quote, 99.9% chance he thinks you're a fucking moron, end quote. So, he's entitled to his opinions about people. The point is, he isn't wrong about Efilism. The character doesn't mean much. It's whether what he says is true. I prefer to encourage the truth rather than ignorance. Jeremy replies, he's entitled to his opinions about people. The point is, he isn't wrong about Efilism. The character doesn't mean much. It's whether what he says is true. I prefer to encourage the truth rather than ignorance. You mean he isn't wrong about life, as Efilism is basically a critique of life. But Efilism isn't necessarily fact or truth. It's more opinion, and that it's a particular perspective of the world and life in general, tilted towards the notion that suffering outweighs happiness or comfort. Not everyone feels or thinks that way. There certainly are valid points, but it mainly just suggests people feel bad about and think badly of things, of life in general, or it justifies the circumstances for the already miserable. People won't stop breeding, and those in powers don't prefer a global destruction because it would interrupt their profits and advantageous positions. Wars are usually fought far away from castles and palaces for a reason, just like NFL games are hosted far from libraries and tea parties. Division is supported as long as it perpetuates the establishment's status quo, as long as it furthers the agenda of the powerful. Divide and conquer. Wars are fought now and then, but if people are too divided, they won't cooperate in the factories and fields. If too much damage is done, if too many wars are fought, there wouldn't be factories and fields for the kings and queens to benefit. So, things are sustained. Notice certain countries sometimes limit the number of children per family, but they never completely prohibit reproduction. They need sheep to fleece. They need workers in the factories. They need football players to compete against other football players to generate money for the owners. The establishment always has and always will support and endorse procreation for that reason. There are many valid points, but it's just not practical to think we will voluntarily discontinue life on the planet. It's a fun idea to entertain, but that's about it. Humans persevere through cancer, through coma, through tragedy and disease. If these things can't sway the course of life, a little rational discussion won't. We'll likely have to wait for the supernova. Until then, try not to reproduce. Don't support Elon Musk, or his cosmic aspirations either. But grab a bag of popcorn as you observe those that do. It's quite George Carlin, cynical type, whatever. That's quite a bit of a glib statement there, Jeremy. And Gary receives a check from the government, so if you live in the United States, you're likely chipping in already. I'll just skip down to where I respond. Jeremy, not everyone feels or thinks that 2 + 2 = 4. So I'm basically just implying here that it doesn't matter what people on the conscious level, and certainly at least in a conversation about these subjects, what the typical person would say about the axiological asymmetry, for example, the fact that suffering outweighs happiness. What matters is what is demonstrated. And it's quite evident what's demonstrated, but I'll continue on reading my comment. That the negative suffering outweighs the positive of happiness is demonstrable in innumerable ways. And the only reason you will be able to find as many people claim the opposite as you do is because they aren't forced to run actual, rigorous, logically concordant experiments to prove the integrity of their own casually proclaimed revocable propositions. Jeremy starts off by quoting again, that the negative of suffering outweighs the positive of happiness is demonstrated in innumerable ways, and the only reason you'll be able to find many people claim the opposite is because they aren't forced to run actual, rigorous, logically concordant experiments to prove the integrity of their own casually proclaimed revocable propositions. Just as you fail to prove your point here by not referencing any actual, rigorous, logically concordant experiment supporting it. If it is demonstrable in innumerable ways, why not provide some examples? Especially if you're going to dismiss others for failing to do so. I respond, you are in antinatalist, Efilist territory here. Inmendham has literally uploaded dozens upon dozens of videos explaining it. Others, including myself, have reiterated it in comment sections and sometimes videos to confused antagonists, such as yourself, etc. What I essentially stated was that optimism-biased Borg wouldn't be able to demonstrate the integrity of their propositions about value symmetry. Efilists like myself easily behaviorally demonstrate the integrity of our propositions about the asymmetry. But go ahead though. Pretend that the prevention of the worst torture and agony is less or equally urgent than the facilitation of the best ecstasy and euphoria. Any example or experiment conducted with that basic layout as the integral dynamic will demonstrate the integrity of the axiological asymmetry that I described. I am not convinced that you are being fully, brutally honest with yourself and in assessing this without excess psychological barriers, so I've lost patience with keeping up explaining things. The information is on here, and it has been extensively detailed. I suspect you're not going to be so inclined as to put in much effort to justify the status quo counterclaim you mentioned above, but even if you do, I guarantee you it's going to be rubbish, because what it represents simply isn't even close to being accurate. Jeremy's last comment, quoting, "You're in AN/Ethel territory here. Inmendham has literally uploaded dozens upon dozens of videos explaining it. Others, including myself, have reiterated it in comment sections and sometimes videos to confused antagonists such as yourself, etc. What I essentially stated was that optimism-biased Borg wouldn't be able to demonstrate the integrity of their propositions about value symmetry. Ethelists like myself easily behaviorally demonstrate the integrity of our propositions about the asymmetry. Yet out of dozens upon dozens of videos and other material, you cannot link or reference one demonstrating actual, rigorous, logically concordant experiments beyond this particular asymmetry argument, after dismissing others specifically for not doing so. But go ahead though, pretend that the prevention of the worst torture and agony is less or equally urgent than the facilitation of the best ecstasy and euphoria. But how many people or how many animals actually endure the worst torture or agony? That is irrelevant. It doesn't matter how much animals endure the worst torture or agony. By definition, the worst is, of all of the animals that do, those at the most severe level. So obviously the how many is going to be a fraction, but that is completely besides the point. So I'm not sure why you're asking that question. The whole point is comparing the scale, comparing the depth of the suffering to the depth, the weight of the suffering to the weight of the happiness, of the pleasure. It is just obvious, and not just as a thought experiment, but just literally through, especially if you have any significant level of life experience, not even if having life experience, just observing the spectrum of human and animal conscious life experience, observing the worst and observing the best. You wouldn't place yourself in the worst in order to experience the best, and you would, if confronted with both, you would put in much more effort to avoid the worst than you would put in to pursue the best. That demonstrates the asymmetry. One could argue that animals are, for the large part, seeking to prevent the worst torture and agony while seeking to facilitate the highest level of comfort. Yes, obviously everyone is doing that, but they're essentially the same, is what you'll come to understand once you realize how suffering is related to supposed comfort. Comfort is literally the release, the relief from the negative. Thus, social movements demanding better wages, better standards of living for the impoverished, these are efforts, regardless of success, to prevent, reduce, and eliminate forms of suffering. In the wild, lion cubs, other young animals are killed. Is that really as bad as it seems? After all, they wouldn't have to endure years of strife, struggle, and potential injury or disease as the one or two who survive do. As an additional example, yes, large felines practically rip their prey to shreds, and it is quite hideous. But in most instances, their prey is choked out, rendered unconscious before the feast begins. Oh, how comparatively fantastic. The only reason you'll be able to find many people claim the opposite is because they aren't forced to run actual, rigorous, logically concordant experiments to prove the integrity of their own casually proclaimed, revocable propositions. That's the error of the Efilist approach. People are not conducting rigorous, logically concordant experiments to determine if life is worth living or perpetuating, and more than likely, they won't. I know that, but what I'm saying is, if you're not going to walk the walk and you're just going to talk, then you're not going to be taken very seriously. As you yourselves state, you are addressing sentience here. You are addressing feeling, suffering organisms, or at least their optimism bias concerning self-preservation or perpetuation. They navigate life largely through feelings and impulses, thus the predicaments. You can't expect such to conduct rigorous, logically concordant experiments to judge the circumstances. Humans are able to. Obviously, I'm not speaking about non-human animals. much less decide to discontinue life as a whole because of it. You are basically claiming to be able to logically persuade the illogical. The premise is fallacious from that perspective alone. Well, you're strawmanning, essentially. But generally, the Efilis idea is impractical. And throughout history, at every step of the way in the trajectory of progress, lots of what turned out to be successful endeavors, which advanced, for example, human rights and things of this nature, which, yes, it's an overused example, but it's, I would say, a relatively effective one. At the time, they were often described as impractical, etc. That has no bearing on the truth value of the propositions themselves. Are we arguing philosophy, or are you talking about just practicality? And besides, Efilis are aware of the practical prospects of actualizing the philosophy. Obviously, the optimal solution is not going to be achievable, most likely, but you start with the most accurate descriptions expressible, and then from there, you apply it in the best way that you can. Ultimately, 100% of people will not agree to annihilation in whatever form, or even non-procreation. Well, duh. But even a few individuals that go on to not procreate because of interactions that they have been exposed to can potentially implicate that dozens and dozens and dozens, hundreds even possibly, or even more, sentient organisms, human beings, were not brought into existence because of that. Factoring in all of the generations that would extend from those otherwise would-be parents. An intentional, voluntary event to discontinue life on the planet will not happen, due to biological, impulsive factors and due to hideously selfish factors as hinted at above. Yes, most likely it will not. We are aware of this. A lot of this thread is you're arguing points that there's no reason to argue, because there is no disagreement present that is going to be modified. Efilism proposes a distressful perspective of life while simultaneously proposing a disheartening solution to it. Yes, disheartening to the masses. If you're totally rational, at least when you have your thinking cap on, so to speak, and you're able to gradually detach at the personal level from this, and taking your interest out of it, plausibly you will come to find it to be a comforting prospect, okay? A solution which will never even occur. It's a double dose of distress without resolution. Right, because what we should do is have a goal, and then if we find it's going to be unlikely that it will be fully achieved, we should cut it down halfway and then strive for that. And then that itself might even not be practical, or it might not be fully obtained, and then that will be cut even more. No, you start with the full truth, the full prospects, the full context, the full situation at hand, and you say, this is what we have to work with. This is the truth. And then from there, you will most likely have the most significant response.